How would you describe the Soviet Union as a country in the terms that they treated sex? What kind of country it was?
I think there were three main ways of, three main spheres of sex. There was the official sphere, and during Stalin times and not long after, there was the official description of what sex should be. And we know exactly, it should be 2 minutes, once per week, and no longer. And it should be between a man and a woman in marriage. Full stop. This was the official sex. Then we have the sort of sex of the ordinary people. And I would say that probably it resembles sex anywhere else in the world. We're animals, and many people had normal sex lives, maybe not a lot of sexual education, but still they had no complaints, people we've talked to.
Okay.
And then there's the third category, and that's the category that I would call Soviet sex. That's the category where the strictures of totalitarianism entered into people's lives. And that is where all of the pain and lies and evil manifested itself. And that was seen everywhere from prohibitions against homosexuality, against abortions, lots of different problems in different decades, depending on where you were and at what time you were living in. People were afraid. People were afraid that if they did something wrong in their career, they would be accused of a sexual crime that they didn't even commit by a neighbor who wanted their apartment. On the other hand, people were able to commit sexual crimes as long as they were a powerful member of the party. They could rape young girls, and it happened very often, even here in small towns in Ukraine. And that's what I think of as the evil, the dark side of Soviet sex. And really, it's what happens under totalitarianism, when there's no free press, when there's no free courts, when someone is raped, there's nowhere to turn.
Okay, you just said that there was no sexual education, and why do you think it was such a taboo in the Soviet times? Why sex was such a taboo? Why was it such a repressed subject, repressed topic?
I think that there's a relationship between how free a society is and how freely it speaks about sex. And the less free the society, the more, of course, the more control that the government wants to have over every individual. And in a totalitarian society, the deepest form of control, this is the subject of Orwell, is the bedroom and even your unconscious thoughts and your desires. And so in the Soviet Union, sex was so highly controlled that people were afraid to even speak about it, because maybe they might say something wrong, or maybe their words could be used against them, or maybe well, we know that teachers weren't allowed to speak about sexual education. The hero of our film tried to get schools in Vinnytsia and across Ukraine to teach about sexual education, because he was seeing already 14, 15-year-old girls and boys with sexual diseases. And he was seeing young girls who were pregnant and coming and saying, but I didn't kiss him while we were in bed.
Yeah, I don't understand why I get pregnant. Yeah.
Exactly. So Dr. Mikhail Stern, he saw the suffering that this closed society created, and he tried to open it up. He failed, of course, and ended up in jail. But for me, and for the people working on our film, he's a hero, because he was trying to fight against a totalitarian system that made sex a taboo, and instead to speak about it closer to how we speak about it today.
Okay, you just mentioned it. You just said about this people who, after the revolution, they said that we want to have the sexual freedom. So, and I know that you researched the Soviet Union, how the treatment of sex changed during the times. So can you tell about that? How did it change, actually?
Yeah, this was something that I didn't know about. and that was that the revolution was not only a revolution in politics and in economics, it was a sexual revolution as well. And there were it was a crazy time. There were parades down with virginity. Virginity was considered to be a bourgeois concept. And so in schools, 17, 18-year-old kids were organized to march against virginity. In one small town, in several small towns, there was an idea that all boys and girls should register, and if they don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, they can choose from a list, have sex, just like drinking a glass of water, as Alexandra Kollontai put it. So there's been a long history throughout time of people going into this extreme sexual openness. And so in Russia, it took the form of women and boys, but mostly women, were pressured into having sex, because if they said no, it was a sign that they didn't support the ideals of communism.
Okay.
They weren't sharing themselves. And that was used against mostly women. And within a few years, this kind of phase died out. Now, in 1933, all of this openness towards sexuality was completely closed by Stalin. And
why do you think it happened?
I think Stalin wanted order. Stalin wanted to control the citizens in every way. He also realized that in order to build a big army and lots of workers, you need marriage and no birth control and no abortion and lots of babies. And so I think he did everything that he could to create those circumstances. But I also think that he had a sick fear of the non-traditional, which...
Was there a kind of sexual revolution in the Soviet Union? You know?
Well, certainly there's the Stalinist era, which is tied up with the war era, which was tied up with sexual atrocities committed, again, mostly against women, both by German troops, Russian troops. This was a decade plus of sexual horror, which I think left a wound on the Soviet mind, the Soviet psyche, up until the late 50s or early 60s. I think that by the 60s, after Stalin had died, and there was the beginnings of some thaw, there was a little bit more openness. And I discovered that starting from the 60s, there was a serious, large-scale program to find young boys and girls, swallows and ravens, they were called, and recruit them into the KGB, train them in how... First, they had to train them in sex. So, ironically, one of the few places in the Soviet Union
where can you learn something about sex was KGB.
Yes. So in school, they didn't teach you about sex. But if the KGB thought you could be a good sex spy, the first thing they did, they brought 100 students into a class. And we know this from several memoirs of one in particular of a woman who was able to escape. And she's in our film, in one of our reconstructions. They took 100, 200 students and they showed them pornography. And most of them were totally freaked out, but that's how they introduced them to sex. And they talked about sex openly. Again, probably nowhere else in the Soviet Union were people talking about this as openly. And then they actually had these students watch people have sex, and then they themselves had to have sex with either other students or visiting army cadets. And they would, according to the memoir of our hero, the army cadets, these young boys, 17, 18, 19, their job was to say no. Girls had to seduce them. And there were up to 10,000 sex spies working in Moscow, Petersburg, across Eastern Europe, and in places like London, Paris, throughout the world. and they were extremely successful. In fact, there was a special branch of sex spy. It was a 40, 50-year-old man who focused on the secretaries of important NATO strategists, generals, colonels in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. And these male spies would find the secretaries, who mostly were either widowed or didn't have husbands. They pretended to fall in love with them. Many cases they actually married them for many years and asked them to start to bring home materials from their boss. And when the Cold War ended and the wall fell and the archives were opened, they realized that the Soviet Union knew everything that NATO was doing, everything that NATO was planning, and almost half of the secretaries, the older ones without husbands, were sleeping with or married to or having affairs with Russian or Soviet male sex spies. So until this day, the programs continue.